This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by LMX Mabella. Chapter 3. Rounding the final library corner, Hermione found Draco sat gingerly in an armchair. Acting on an impulse, she leaned over him and started checking his body for bruises. "Merlin, Draco, are you okay?" she whispered. He flinched as she touched him, but shook his head. "I'm fine." "You're clearly not. Come on, we need to go and see Madame Pomfrey." "No, Granger, I don't want to," Draco said firmly. She sat on the arm of his chair, gripping her hands together to stop herself from running her hands through his hair. "That was awful," Hermione breathed. "I can't believe he did that to you. He's a professor, for Godric's sake. You could have been seriously injured." Draco was angry. He wanted to take it out on someone. "Granger, stop. If you're going to fuss, I might as well go to Pansy." "Yes, right," she replied and moved to the seat opposite. "So, why were you goading Ron this time?" "I knew it. It's always my fault, isn't it? Did I deserve what I got? I'm surprised you're even talking to me after what I called you at the World Cup." There was a pause. Hermione tilted her head. "What is this really about, Draco?" He scowled and remained silent. Eventually Hermione padded back over to him and sat on the arm of his chair again. To both of their surprise, Draco pulled her onto his lap and buried his head in her neck. She sat awkwardly for a moment before leaning into his chest. "My father was one of the Death Eaters torturing muggles after the Quidditch World Cup." "I wondered whether that might be the case." Draco sighed. "All summer he's been having these meetings with other people I can only assume must also be Death Eaters. He asked me to join them sometimes. Luckily, I had a plausible excuse each time. But what happens when I don't? What happens when I'm expected to be there? Why don't I get a fucking choice?" Hermione wished she knew what to say to make it better, but she couldn't think of anything. So she just pushed her body closer to him and he tightened his arms around her. "So, when Moody did that to me, I just thought, here it goes again, yet another aspect of my life I have no control over. And will there be any retribution for it? I doubt it. No one gives a crap about me. Just imagine if a teacher did that to Saint Potter. They'd probably be in Azkaban by now." "Draco," Hermione breathed. I care. I care about all of those things. I care about you." He rested his forehead against hers. "Maybe, but who am I to you really, in the scheme of things? You've got Potter and Weasley." Draco's warm breath tickled her cheek. She could smell peppermint. Hermione wanted to show him how much he meant to her. That yes, Harry and Ron were her friends, but Draco was more than that. She glanced down at his lips, and her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could feel it. She swallowed, unable to summon her Gryffindor courage. "You're my best friend, Draco." He leaned back, the moment lost. "Yeah, okay." Draco sought for a change of subject. "What's in the box?" Hermione recovered quickly. Leaving the safety of his lap, she stood up and sat again in the chair opposite, lifting the aforementioned box from her satchel. She took off the lid and showed him the contents. Inside were about 50 badges, all of different colors, but all bearing the same letter. S-P-E-W. "Spoo?" he asked, picking up a badge. "What's this about?" "Not Spoo," Hermione replied primly. "It's S-P-E-W, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare." "I've not heard of that before." "No, well, you wouldn't have. I've only just started it." Draco frowned. "How many members do you have?" "Well, if you join, 2. Hermione brandished a sheaf of parchment at him. "I've been researching it thoroughly. Elf enslavement goes back centuries. I can't believe no one's done anything before now." "You know they like the way things are. After Potter wrongly freed Dobby, our other elves were in uproar about it." She narrowed her eyes, but chose not to broach the Malfoy elves just yet. Recalling Draco's earlier comments, she said, "Don't they deserve a choice?" He glowered. "Are you sure you weren't meant to be in Slytherin?" 2 sickles to join. That buys a badge, and the proceeds can fund our leaflet campaign." It was Friday, the 30th of October, and delegations from Beaubaton and Durmstrang were due to be arriving at Hogwarts for the Triwizard Tournament at any moment. The evening was cold and clear. Dusk had almost fallen, and the pale, transparent-looking moon was already shining over the Forbidden Forest. Hermione was standing between Harry and Ron, shivering in anticipation for the new arrivals. "Nearly 6, said Ron, checking his watch and then staring down the drive which led to the front of the gate. "How do you reckon they're coming? The train?" "I doubt it," Hermione replied. "How then? Broomsticks?" suggested Harry, looking up at the starry sky. They scanned the darkening grounds excitedly, but nothing was moving. All was still silent and quite as usual. Hermione was beginning to feel cold and wished the two schools would hurry up. She didn't have to wait long before each arrived with grand finesse. One enormous horse-drawn carriage and another magnificent ship that rose from the lake. After some time, all students were seated back in the great hall. Hermione was readily exacerbated at Harry and Ron's fascination with Victor Krum. She could acknowledge that he was very skilled at the World Cup, and he might be somewhat attractive, but at least she could remain composed in his presence. "The tournament will be officially opened at the end of the feast," Dumbledore announced. "I invite you all to eat, drink, and make yourself at home." The great hall seemed somehow much more crowded than usual, even though there were barely 20 additional students here. Perhaps it was because their differently colored uniforms stood out so clearly against the Hogwarts robes. Hermione kept glancing over at the Slytherin table towards Draco. They had barely spoken since she hadn't been able to garner the courage to kiss him. She wondered whether he was avoiding her. Every time she attempted to make eye contact, she ended up with Krum's attention instead. Why did he keep smiling at her? The feast eventually came to an end, and Dumbledore stood again to address the room. "As you know, 3 champions compete in the tournament, one from each participating school. The champions will be chosen by an impartial selector. The Goblet of Fire." Dumbledore took out his wand and tapped 3 times on the top of a nondescript casket. The lid creaked slowly open. Reaching inside, he pulled out a large, roughly hewn wooden cup. It would have been entirely unremarkable had it not been full to the brim with dancing blue-white flames. Placing the goblet carefully on the top of the casket, Dumbledore continued. "Anybody wishing to submit themselves as champion must write their name and school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it in here." The noise of chattering in the great hall slowly rose as students grew increasingly more excited. Hermione rolled her eyes as she overheard Fred and George Weasley's idea to manipulate the age line around the goblet. "It'll never work," she crooned. Chapter 4. The occupants of Hogwarts had only one day to wait before Dumbledore announced the champions. When Hermione, Harry, and Ron entered the candlelit great hall, it was almost full. The Goblet of Fire had been moved. It was now standing in front of the teacher's table. Taking their usual seats, Hermione caught Draco's eyes across the room. He glanced down at his chest to a small badge with SPEW emblazoned across the center. Not caring who was watching, she beamed. The corner of Draco's mouth twitched as he then briefly turned his head from left to right. Hermione almost gasped with the realization. Her badge was attached to the robes of every student in Slytherin. She tilted her head, wondering how he had managed such a feat. "Hermione," Ron elbowed her gently. "You okay?" "Oh, yeah," she paused, suddenly thinking. "Hey, can you see the badges all the Slytherins are wearing?" He peered over and said derisively, "We already know they're all snakes. Why do they need a badge to prove it?" Draco's eyes glittered mischievously as he caught the moment she understood. He had enchanted the badgers to look like snakes to anyone but them. It really was quite an impressive display of charm work, if he did say so himself. Pansy Parkinson noticed Hermione looking over, and shifting closer to Draco, she puffed out her chest, delighted with the badge he had gifted her. Hermione couldn't help but snort with laughter as she took in the image of Pansy, sporting elfish welfare attire. Even Draco was struggling to keep a straight face. Suddenly, almost all noise ceased and had spun to the front of the hall. Dumbledore got slowly to his feet and gazed around the students, smiling genially.
"Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision," he said. "I estimate that it requires 1 more minute. Now, when the champions' names are called, I would ask them to please come up to the top of the hall, walk along the staff table, and go through into the next chamber."
He indicated the door behind the staff table,
"where they will be receiving their first instructions."
He took out his wand and gave a great sweeping wave with it. At once, all the candles dimmed. The goblet of fire now shone more brightly than anything in the room, the sparkling, bright, bluey whiteness of the flames almost painful on the eyes. The flames inside the goblet turned suddenly red again. Sparks began to fly from it. Next moment, a tongue of flame shot into the air. A charred piece of parchment fluttered out from it. The whole room gasped. Dumbledore caught the piece of parchment and held it at arm's length, so that he could read it by the light of the flames, which had turned back to blue-white.
"The champion for Durmstrang,"
he read in a strong, clear voice,
"will be Viktor Krum."
A storm of applause and cheering erupted across the hall. Following a similar pattern of silence and commotion, the 2 remaining champions were announced, Fleur Delacour and Cedric Diggory.
"Excellent! Now we have our 3 champions. I'm sure I can count upon all of you to give every ounce of support you can muster in the task to come. By cheering the champions on, you will contribute in a very real—"
The headmaster suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and borne up on it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed, Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written up on it. There was a long pause, during which the wizard simply stared at the slip in his palm. Eventually, he cleared his throat and read out,
"Harry Potter."
Hermione was aware that every head in the great hall had turned to look at Harry. There was no applause. A buzzing as though of angry bees was starting to fill the room, some students standing up to get a better look at him as he sat frozen in his seat. Up at the top table, Professor McGonagall stood and walked to whisper urgently with Dumbledore, who bent his ear towards her, frowning slightly. Hermione absently noticed Harry turn to her and Ron.
"I didn't put my name in it," he said. "You know I didn't." "Harry Potter," the headmaster called again. "Harry, up here, if you please."
"Go on," Hermione whispered, giving him a slight push. Harry got to his feet, and Hermione's heart sank as she watched him stumble away. It wasn't just the students staring at him, so were the teachers. She worried at her lip, knowing how awful he must be feeling at this moment. Turning to Ron, she went to speak, but paused when she saw his expression. Staring down at the table, hands clenched tightly together, Ron's forehead was furrowed into a deep scowl and his lips pursed. The occupants of the great hall had begun to vacate, so Hermione nudged him with her shoulder. "Shall we go up?" she asked.
"Go where?"
he replied blankly. "To the common room?"
"Right, okay."
As they stood, Hermione tried again. "Are you okay, Ron?" He glowered at her.
"Of course I'm bloody well not. What did he use? The invisibility cloak?"
"What are you talking about? Harry clearly had no more idea than any of us that his name had been entered into the goblet."
"Yeah, right. I thought he might have told me, especially if it was a cloak. It would have covered both of us."
"Ron, honestly, did you see his face? He looked devastated." He smirked nastily.
"Only in case he got in trouble for it. I'm sure he's just been dying for some more attention this year."
With that, Ron stalked off, leaving Hermione to make her own way to the common room. He was nowhere to be found when she pushed through the portrait hall, so she went up to bed, determined to sort out this mess in the morning. To be continued. Thank you for listening to these chapters of This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by LMXMabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr.